set out by the Defence Secretary, where he warns about bringing down the F-35 programme through ceasing provision to the global spares. I'm sure Minister Pollard would be able to give more detail to it, but it feels pretty straightforward to me. The text that you've put in front of me does provide for that balancing, because the question is, would it contribute or undermine peace and security?
The Arms Trade Treaty in its entirety is pretty clear. It's not presenting balancing tests, it's presenting absolutes. And the absolutes that it presents are that if there is a risk that exporting something contributes to a breach of international humanitarian law, then the export should not be allowed.
Is it not quite clear even from that text that it's saying, I mean, both the text in itself, but Article 7 is clear that this is not an absolute article, because it's saying if the export is not prohibited under Article 6. So I read from that.
But it's also saying if the item could be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law, the exporting state party, i.e. you, shall not authorise the export.
I mean, we undertake these assessments on the basis of all of the legal advice available to us. The legal advice that we have is that Article 7 provides for a balancing test. We've set that out in skeleton arguments before the court. That is, I'm struggling slightly to see. I can see that there is a question about whether you put more weight on A or B, but given that it's clear that the absolute prohibitions are in Article 6, which is explicit from Article 7.1, seems a reasonable reading of Article 7 that this is an article which provides for more than just absolutes.
Our challenge, Mr. Falconer, is that we can't find any other supporting authority that would support that line of argument, and indeed even the High Court judged it merely tenable. So perhaps we could make progress in this way. Perhaps you could undertake to write to the committee to set out the legal reasoning that supports your interpretation that you presented to us today. Would that be okay?
Yes, I do think it is in the skeleton argument, but I'm happy to expand on it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Weston.
Minister Pollard, and that is, just interested to know what is your understanding of the purpose of the RAF surveillance flights?
The RAF surveillance flights from RAF Akrotiri are solely for hostage rescue. So they're designed to seek to identify the hostages that are being held, and then for a test to be applied to the information, if they are able to locate any, that says we will transfer that information only when we believe that the information that is transferred will be used in accordance with IHL. It's not for any other aspect other than hostage rescue. The flights are unarmed. They were previously carried out by Shadow R1.
When are they?
So we don't give out details of operational flights as standard practice.
Total number there?
I would need to check the total number, and I can come back to the committee if that's appropriate to release that information. As standard practice, we don't often reveal the flights or the frequency of flights. As these are unarmed aircraft, many of them will squawk and can be picked up on open source. So even though the MOD may not reveal them, there may be alternative methods that the committee can find the answer.
These flights are identifying the locations of hostages?
They're seeking to do that, yes.
Okay. Just keen, really, whether your department can confirm whether Israel's been using the F-35 in Gaza.
So use of that would be a matter for the FCDO to assess. Routinely, the Ministry of Defence would not assess the operational use of partner nations of military assets, but the particular use and tests of that would be an FCDO-led question.
If I could ask Mr. Faulkner then, or Minister Bryant, on what basis has the government identified that there is a clear risk that the export of F-35 components would cause serious IHL violations? I appreciate it goes back to slightly where we've been before on this, but clearly.
If I might just say a little bit about the likely use of F-35s. So F-35 is, I think, makes up 40 of the 300 combat aircraft available to the Israelis. What I'm about to say is supposition rather than the hard fact. It is not obvious for the, we are not notified about the use of F-35 by Israel, and there's certainly is at least one occasion where we know that F-35 aircraft was used in a strike, which is in July 2024.
In Gaza.
In Gaza, against Mohammed Deif. It is likely, we would suppose, that the F-35, as Israel's only fifth-generation combat aircraft, is used much more often for other tasks where the air defence, being able to conceal yourself from another state, is more likely to be required.
Like Qatar?
For example, Qatar. So we would not think it is likely to be a very routine part of the strikes in Gaza, which come across our screen so often.
Experts tell us that it's really not the most appropriate vehicle of force for use in Gaza, that the F-15 is more appropriate. So why do we think it should be permissible for them to use it anyway?
I'm not sure I followed the end of the question.
So experts tell us that the F-35 is not actually the most appropriate vehicle of force in the aerospace to be using for this kind of conflict. That the F-15 is a far better vehicle. So why are we even allowing the F-35? We've talked about the permissions, the trade permissions, because it's actually not the most appropriate.
We wouldn't want it to be
using.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, we have suspended a whole series of export licenses for F-15s, Apache helicopters, drones. In the assessments that we do, the most regular sort of use of or military equipment being used that is most often associated with strikes of real concern. Sometimes it's artillery, often it's drones, sometimes it will be an airstrike, but in some of the instances that will immediately come to mind, including the strikes on a hospital, it will not be necessarily combat aircraft that are involved. Where those combat aircraft are not F-35, then they have been suspended. The reason why we have not suspended F-35 is not because we think conceptually it cannot be used in Gaza. As I say, in July 2024, it does appear to have been used in Gaza. It is because of the wider issues that we described in the debate about Article 7.
I understand that. It just seems that it's almost like an academic argument, given that it shouldn't. There's no need to be using it, I guess is my simple point. If you say, Minister Faulkner, that it has been used, and you gave a date when you believe it was used, what is the likelihood, what are the chances of being used again in Gaza?
So I want to be clear, Mr. Weston, that it is very difficult for us to determine, given all of the things that have been said so far, exactly what weaponry has been used when in Gaza. The lack of international journalists, all of the obvious reasons that would make those determinations difficult. I suspect that the F-35 is not used regularly. The strike in July 2024, I think the Israelis believed was against a particularly high-value target senior in the leadership of Hamas. So it may be that it has been used on other occasions for similar such strikes. We would be surprised if it were being used with any great regularity, but it's difficult to give the committee very precise answers on that, given the constraints about the information available.
It could be used in the West Bank.
It in theory could be used in the West Bank. I'm not aware of any reporting of in the West Bank recently that could be similar to this sort of signature of an F-35 strike in the way that we've seen in other places, but I can double check that point and come back to you.
And just to be absolutely clear, Mr. Weston, we have rejected and ceased licenses where people have sought to export other equipment for other airplanes, which we were fairly clear would and could and in all likelihood would be used in Gaza. And the only difference about the F-35 is the way that the whole system is constructed.
Mr. Pollard, just come back to you. Do you have an estimate for the number of sorties that have been undertaken by F-35, and what information does the government have on targeting and the ordnance used by the Israeli F-35?
We don't routinely collect information on the activities of Israeli planes, and so we don't have a lot of that information that I'm afraid I can share.
So with the surveillance flights, we don't actually keep data, we don't record anything about any of the amount of destruction of any part of Gaza during those flights?
Oh, so if we're looking at the activities of the hostage search flights, that's solely for the intention of locating hostages, so that all the activities of those flights are based on hostage location to assist in the search and rescue for those hostages, and so that's their primary and only tasking. We don't ask them to look at additional activities. Their sole tasking is on hostage rescue.
So, but may not ask them specifically to do that, but in terms of the information recorded, and I'm not familiar with how RAF surveillance flights work, but I can imagine that they are recording data of an urban landscape across Gaza as they are flying, and then from that data you would be able to ascertain the amount of damage and the type of ordnance that may be used.
It would not be normal for me the flights are solely there for hostage rescue. So their intention is to use the technologies and capabilities to look at that. As a result, we don't look at beyond those activities. And it'd be hard for me to give out further details due to operational security.
I understand, but in the absence of any journalists, any media being allowed in Gaza, even media reporters aren't allowed to film when they're dropping humanitarian aid into Gaza. So there's a complete absence of information. It just perhaps strikes as strange that there would be data that's available from surveillance flights that could be used to ascertain the amount of munitions and the type of munitions that are being used over Gaza.
That's not the purpose of those flights.
It's not the purpose, it's just whether we as a government, through the RAF, have that data.
Whether the data would be held in such a format that it would be able to identify that, because effectively, instead of, without going into too much detail, instead of looking at the landscape, the geographies, it's trying to detect information that would pinpoint a location of individual hostages. So in respect, the tasking of the aircraft would be a different set of tasking than you are suggesting might be available in the data.
Okay. Is that something you could ask the RAF to do?
It would not normally be a thing that we would look at in relation specifically to this, because the tasking and our entire mission out of RAF Akrotiri is solely for hostage search and rescue. If there were to be alternative taskings or based on a wider aspect, that would require a very different approach, and it may also affect the permissions that may be available to the planes to operate in the area.
I understand, but I guess if going back to Minister Faulkner's point about making an assessment, if there's an opportunity for the government to make an assessment of what is happening in Gaza, when all of us are denied that because we have no media feed about what's happening, the UK actually has an opportunity to determine or assess what is happening from those flights, and therefore the government has an opportunity to do that, which would actually be very helpful then in determining whether a genocide is happening in Gaza.
It's difficult to go further in answering the question due to the fact that we don't routinely comment on intelligence matters. If there were additional taskings placed on those aircraft beyond just hostage rescue, I think the ability of those aircraft to be able to deliver those activities would be more constrained. So as a result, it has been the clear policy of this government that those aircraft are only and solely used for hostage rescue, and we don't provide any other data or collect any data beyond hostage rescue.
We're looking the other way.
No, we are absolutely looking for the hostages. That's the sole purpose of those flights. That is the mission that they've been tasked with, to try and locate the hostages that are continuing to be held in Hamas captivity. That's their job. That's the sole purpose, and all the capabilities that the aircraft may possess are tasked with that in mind.
And if I may...
So you are not supplying what you find to Mr. Falconer's IHL compliance cell?
If the Foreign Office would want to know about hostage rescue data, then there'd be a conversation that would take place. But as the aircraft is solely focused on hostage rescue, using the capabilities for hostage rescue, that may not necessarily be of interest to other government departments unless it's around hostage rescue, which is what the data is there for.
Foreign Office ever asked the Ministry of Defence whether it can collect data to help it assess whether IHL breaches are unfolding?
I'm not aware of that, but I would need to check the wider conversations.
Could you write to us on that? I think
Yes,
it would
I
be
think
useful
that's
to
very
know
useful.
specifically whether the government could do that and when it would choose to do that.
I'm happy coming back to you on that, but just to reinforce, the ability of the RAF aircraft or the contracted aircraft to operate is entirely reliant on the permissions given by nations in the area. If the tasking of those aircraft were to go beyond hostage rescue, I think that would change potentially the calculations around some of those, which would, I think, actually defeat the purpose that you're arguing for in relation to that.
Mr. Maynard.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Going back to the F-35's use in Gaza, I mean, bluntly, I feel the government is being willfully ignorant because the Israeli Air Force itself has tweeted that since October 2023, the service F-35s have flown more than 15,000 operational flight hours, taking part in thousands of sorties in all theatres. So I don't understand how you can sit there and say the F-35 is not involved in Gaza when the Israeli Air Force is saying how many hours it's done.
With respect, Mr. Maynard, in the year that I've been the minister, Israel has flown aircraft in lots of different places. A sortie is not the same as a strike, and it was to be expected of 40 aircraft that there's quite a lot done. The question that the committee has rightly asked is what level of fidelity do we have about F-35 flights into Gaza? And I've given you my
I go back to willful ignorance. So to that point, we have planes going over there. Yeah, we can see bombs being dropped. We can see whether those are, we can join those dots, and we are choosing not to.
Mr. Maynard, I am not showing willful ignorance. I am not ignoring evidence that is before me. We consider, it may be how it looks, but I'm telling the committee that every piece of evidence which is before me and every piece of evidence that is before the Foreign Secretary, we consider. There is a difference, as I'm sure you know, between a drone flight, which happens at a much lower height, and an F-35 flight. You cannot tell from a drone necessarily that there is an F-35 above you unless it strikes beneath you. Here for all of the questions of the committee, but I would prefer not to be told that I'm turning a blind eye to things when I'm telling you that's not what I'm doing.
Okay, my question has been answered. Thank you.
Okay. I want to just move on to some of the arguments that were rehearsed by the government in court. And the government's position, as I understand it, in the skeleton argument and indeed in the argument presented, was that there was no need to calibrate, your phrase, the risk of serious IHL violations, given the importance of the F-35 programme. And so the implication of that is that there is no IHL breach that could potentially be so serious that it would result in a different decision on F-35 exports. Is that the case?
It'd be helpful. Sorry, the use of calibrate is a.
This was a phrase that was used in court, and the judge, in summarising the government's position, concluded that the government was in effect arguing that it had no need to calibrate the different kind of IHL breaches that it was concerned about, in essence, because there was no IHL breach that was going to be so serious or could be so serious that we would stop exporting parts for F-35s. So is that the case?
Chair, without prejudice to the arguments that we made in court, because it's quite difficult for me to zone in on exactly which part of the skeleton argument or the judgment that you're referring to, but I would say
187
of the judgment.
Let me just. So, Paragraph 187, just for the benefit of the committee, says it is obvious that the Secretary of State took the view that the risks of suspending exports into the F-35 programme dramatically outweighed the risks arising from some F-35 programmes exported from the UK being supplied indirectly to Israel. We accept that it was not irrational for the Secretary of State to take the view that a calibration exercise would not have been capable, so dramatically increasing the weight the Secretary of State would have given to the risks of export as to override the consequences of suspension. So the implication of that is that there is no IHL breach so serious that the government would decide enough is enough, we're stopping F-35 exports tomorrow.
That was not quite what I took from that section of the judgment. I think that I'm careful to summarise judges, but my reading of that section was that the judges, having satisfied themselves on the factual position as it currently is, I quoted, I think it's paragraph 164, where they say the grave risk of life in the ongoing military operations is not created by the carve-out and would not be removed by the suspension. I took 187 in that context to mean, with the grave risks to the F-35 programme presented in closed and in the Defence Secretary's argument, weighed against the fact that removing the carve-out would not remove the grave risk to life of the ongoing military operations in the Gaza Strip, that the calibration of those two set of facts meant that the Secretary of State was reasonable not to overly labour on that question in calibration because it was so obvious. That is not to say, I think, Chair, that we make these assessments regularly. We do so with full knowledge of the very serious tests that fall on us from international law, from a whole range of treaties and instruments, including the Genocide Convention. Clearly, if we reach different assessments, then I think questions like this would feel very different indeed. But I read 187 as being recognising ending the carve-out is not going to end the violence in Gaza, and there are very significant implications for Britain's national security and that of our allies. A balancing test was not required, a calibration was not required beyond the one that was provided.
And if I might, the only other point to make is, of course, that the court is not deciding whether the decision was right or wrong. It's deciding whether the decision that was made by government was made lawfully. And of course, it decided that our processes were thorough and lawful.
I think it really concluded that it couldn't judge adherence to an international treaty. In fact, that it was actually for Parliament to hold ministers to account, I think was the tenor of the judgment. But I just want to come back to
Lord Hoffman, didn't it?
So, Chris, let me just come back to the substantive point, which is that the reassurance you're giving to the committee, Mr. Falconer, is that Israel does not have a carte blanche to use F-35s as it so pleases.
Well, the reassurance I'm giving the committee is we will review the whole spectrum of IHL, including the Genocide Convention, on a regular basis. The Foreign Secretary takes that responsibility very seriously, and what decisions might flow from those assessments clearly remain open.
So you've admitted to the committee that there is in effect a line, and that Israel hasn't yet crossed the line. And so even though export of F-35 parts may constitute a serious breach or a risk of a serious breach of international humanitarian law, there could be a point which, if Israel crossed it, a decision would be taken that F-35 exports must cease.
I'm reluctant to agree that there is a red line in the way that you characterise, not because clearly a finding under the Genocide Convention of a serious risk is a very, very solemn finding indeed. The questions that would then flow for the government, I think, was set out in Lord Sumption's evidence. Are there things that can reasonably be done by the British government in order to try and prevent that? Those would be the questions that would flow to us under those circumstances. The reasons why I'm slightly reluctant to accept that those are the considerations of a future time and these are the considerations of today is because it would be to undermine the solemnness of the decisions that we took in September and have taken since. There is no ambiguity in my mind about how grave the circumstances are in Gaza. I am doing everything that I can in order to try and bring about the objectives of this government, which are an immediate ceasefire, aid getting in, hostages being released, no future for Hamas and a two-state solution, I wouldn't want to give the committee the impression that I or anyone else in the government is waiting for some further thing to be triggered before we really seriously get busy. Yeah. We are working as hard as we can. Of course, if we do an assessment and we make a further assessment of risk on the most serious of crimes, clearly we would review everything very carefully at that point, but I wouldn't want to give the impression that we haven't started yet.
I think what we're trying to be clear about is that we're trying to understand how the government operates the selective export licensing criteria, its obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty and its obligations under the Genocide Convention.
Yep.
And the implication of the obligations under all three of those systems, you've assured us, does not mean that Israel has a carte blanche to use F-35s in whatever way it likes.
More importantly, it doesn't have a carte blanche.
Okay.
Full stop.
We've established there's no carte blanche. In which case, then, there must be a line which, if Israel crossed it, the government would take a decision that F-35 exports must cease, no matter the impact on other...
Well, so if I could go to...
On the question of international law, I think that we have already made a solemn judgment about the risk of breaches of international humanitarian law. There are not that many places to go beyond that. One of them is obviously a serious risk of genocide under the Genocide Convention, in which case we would turn ourselves to the obligations that fall on us under those circumstances. And I'm sure, given the seriousness of that, everything would be on the table. But the test would not, we wait in relation to a variety of things until you've made that assessment of serious risk. You would turn your mind to the question of the Genocide Convention. It is clear what the judges think about the F-35's impact on the conflict in Gaza from paragraph 164. They are clear that if we were to stop the carve-out, it would not stop the violence in Gaza. I consider my primary job as the Minister for the Middle East is to try and stop the violence in Gaza. So it is relevant, clearly, that having gone through all of this evidence, the judgment of the two judges is that stopping the suspension would not make a difference to whether or not violence in Gaza
The implication of what you've just said is that if the government came to a conclusion that a duty to prevent genocide had been triggered, then there would be a different kind of behaviour from the government to what we have today, which is a judgment about a risk of breach of the Arms Trade Treaty that has allowed you to continue the exports. You're saying if there was a different judgment under the Genocide Convention, different obligations would flow from the government and presumably exports of F-35 parts would cease.
I think
so the treaties are not equal. And your obligations under the two treaties are not being equally honoured.
So we're honouring all of our obligations to the treaties in the hypothetical situation, which I'm reluctant to get too deeply into. But in this hypothetical situation where a serious risk had been triggered, then there is language both in Article 6 and other treaties which we would need to turn our minds to. And I'm, as for reasons I'm sure you understand, Chair, I'm reluctant to get drawn too much into a hypothetical situation that we are not yet in. All I would say is that clearly this is the crime of crimes and the British government would take it very seriously were we in that situation where we had made that assessment.
And sorry if I might, just one other bit to go back to the judgment of the court. On ground 11, it found that the government had reasonably concluded that there was no realistic possibility of persuading other F-35 partner nations that exports of F-35 parts to Israel should be suspended, and that the UK faced a blunt choice to suspend all exports and accept the defence and diplomatic consequences which would follow, or choose to exercise the carve-out. Now, I can't think of a set of circumstances in which that blunt choice wouldn't change.
Even if the government had concluded that its duty to prevent genocide had been triggered?
Well, what Minister Faulkner is absolutely right about is, of course, I mean, with the proviso that we have to be very careful about hypothetical sets of circumstances, we will always have to keep in review every single element of our engagement in this space, just as previously we decided to suspend our negotiations towards a free trade agreement with Israel.
Given the daily descent into barbarism that we're now witnessing, why is the assessment that you're making on breaches of IHL only going up to the end of June? Why is it so slow?
There is a... So I differentiate between two things. One is that for the purposes of this exercise, which requires real precision, given it is a sort of quasi-judicial process, it does take some time in order to go through the full suite of what we know and pull it into a proper assessment for consideration. That doesn't mean that the British government waits until those assessments have been done. I think the House has heard me comment on events in July, August, etc. in the Chamber. The fact that it takes a little while is, it's a shame, but that is just...
I don't think there's a case for speeding it up.
So I think the ministers of the Foreign Office seek to respond as quickly as we can to the events of the day, whether they are, the strike in Doha this week or the IPC findings of 2 weeks ago. In terms of getting these assessments right, a lot of very important consequences flow from them. So 6 to 8 weeks feels about right, given the considerable amount of Foreign Office resource that is required in order to try and make sure that we get through all of the evidence, which is voluminous, to make assessments proper.
So, given the dynamism of the situation and indeed the speed of descent of what is going on in Gaza, you don't think that 8-week period can be compressed?
Do I think it is possible for the 8 weeks to be compressed? I think it may be theoretically possible, but regrettably the dissent has been happening throughout my period as the minister, so it may be that you could compress in a particular period, but things have got worse over quite a long time, and the Foreign Office needs to be able to maintain a consistency and a depth of assessment across all of these assessments, each one that we do.
Yes, so Chris, do you think there's a sensible, relatively simple middle way through to solving the F-35 carve-out if we had enough gumption to stand up to the US? And it could look something like this. F-35 parts continue to be sold to Israel for defensive purposes only and for not for use in Gaza or other questionable theatres. All parts are tracked, so we can see where those parts are being used, and that is conditional on our continued sale of parts. So yes, we're not contractually bound with Pratt & Whitney, I get that, but this is a conversation. We've got 60,000 people dead. We need to find a way. Why this kind of false argument that the only thing is just a complete stop of all F-35 parts and that's kind of would compromise the UK seems to be a real bogus red herring. So what about that simple way through and trying to find a consensual way through with the US, with Israel, to keep Israel to allow to defend itself, but stop using the F-35s in Gaza and elsewhere?
Well, it's an intriguing idea, and it's the kind of idea which, of course, has occurred to lots of people in the department before me, and for that matter, to me as well. There are some very significant problems with it. One is tracking is not quite as simple as everybody would suggest. I'm informed. Secondly, Mr. Maynard, you referred to the concept of consensual. Consensus in this circumstance means all the nation states together. The way the F-35, Minister Pollard could speak more to the way that the F-35 is constructed and all the rest of it and the supply chain, but most of it is put together in 3 different countries.
Let's talk about the UK, US and Israel. I'm not talking about the rest. We could come up to our own agreement saying the UK government will not allow these parts to be exported. Our parts in the UK, never mind what goes on in other countries.
Indeed, you have to achieve that consensus, and that is not as easy as anybody would like to suppose, which is one of the things that was talked about in the court judgment.
Well, that comes down to determination, doesn't it?
But it's not about gumption, I have to say.
Really?
No. I think people have tried quite hard. It's not it's the way this particular the F-35s are constructed, and the way that the contract is constructed does not make that easy. Now, the diplomatic arrangements are obviously for the Foreign Office, but I don't know whether Minister Pollard wants to answer any specifics about the tracking issue.
I think it's worth understanding how the Joint Strike Fighter, originally CF-35 programme, works on a global basis, in the fact that of the 8 original partner nations, of which the UK is one of those, the US being another, agreements on how the F-35 global support system operates has to be taken by consensus, which means all nations in that original 8 have to agree to that position. It is our assessment currently that we would not get consensus on changes to the process. And the way that the system works is that for UK manufacturers making bits of the F-35, and we make approximately 15% of every F-35 on the planet, where there's no alternative sourcing, it is only us that sources into those programs. UK manufacturers who are contracted either from the US government via one of the two primes, Pratt & Whitney for the engines or Lockheed Martin for the airframes, we make the bits, or UK manufacturers make the bits, whatever that may be, could be the ejector seat or the rear fuselage. That is then exported into the global supply spares pool, which is either sent to a fulfillment centre to be sent out to a different location to an F-35 user, which could be one of the original 8, or it could be a foreign military sales, or to one of the 3 production lines in the US, Italy or Japan.
Luke,
as soon as it leaves, we don't track
the mechanics,
it.
We get all this, but there's 60,000 people dead. So we've got, the contracts are very important, I get that, but we do have some leverage, which is we can stop allowing those parts to be exported if we choose as a country, because we have these things called strategic export license criteria.
Our judgment is...
let me finish, please. So we do have that lever, and we are choosing not to use it because of the contractual obligations. And I think many of us on the committee would say, isn't there a case here, a very, very strong case, to be saying that is not allowed anymore. We will do that, and we play hardball to try and find a sensible, consensual solution. We don't have to hit the nuclear option here, but we can insist and work with those other eight partners to find a way through, and that's something that I think we should be aiming to do.
What I would say, Mr. Pollard first, and then Mr. Falconer.
What I'd say in response to that is that we continue to have conversations with the partner nations, the original 8, in relation to this. Our assessment remains that there's not the possibility of consensus there, and so I understand where you're coming from, but that is not our assessment that is possible. It's also worth understanding that if we were to not export these parts into the global programme, the entire global programme is then at risk.
Which gives us some leverage.
Every F-35 on the planet, which also then has a subsequent risk for peace and security. For instance, it was an F-35 from the Netherlands that shot down one of the Russian drones over Poland. So there is an immediate use of F-35 around the world, supporting our national security requirements and those of our allies. And that would have an immediate effect on that. Now, I think all our partner nations are aware of this debate, because they're having it in their own nations about what is possible, but it remains our position that we do not believe there is the ability to reach a consensus within those original 8 to change that, notwithstanding that I can understand the logic of the argument that's been made. Believe me, that's not lost on us as well, but we do not believe that there is an opportunity to adjust that at this time.
Well, let me just test this. So on page 2 of the advice that we have just published, which you supplied to the Secretary of State for Business and Trade, it says that senior MOD officials have engaged with the F-35 Joint Programme Office to understand what options might be available to mitigate the impact of a UK licensing suspension. Sadly, the next paragraph is redacted and summarised with the words, "There are significant obstacles to any changes to the present structure." Given the constraints on us in open session today, could you give us a flavour of what those obstacles are?
It would not be appropriate for me to reveal confidential conversations between the partner nations. The gisting of that element that was redacted is correct. It remains our assessment that we would be unable to achieve a consensus on alterations to the way that the global F-35 programme works.
We have spent time with lots of supply chain experts. We have spent time with former senior leaders in the Royal Air Force. And I think we are still perplexed as to why it is impossible to not, in effect, ground F-35s in Israel while preserving the F-35 fleet elsewhere. Given the constraints on you, in terms of the evidence you can present today, could you look again at how you could explain to us here in Parliament that it is impossible to ground F-35 planes in Israel without grounding the fleet around the world?
I'm happy coming back to the committee, but it would be the same as the evidence presented in the Secretary of State's letter, in the fact that the F-35 system is a global system that does not operate different systems for different nations. It's a single global system, and in which circumstances any changes to how the F-35 procurement system on a global basis works requires consensus, and we do not believe we can achieve consensus.
Has just told us that Israel does not have a carte blanche, that there is a line that exists, that when Israel cross that line, there will have to be consequences. So at some point, this bridge is going to have to be crossed. And it could be you're telling us that that bridge requires a consensus amongst the partners. But we just need to understand how the UK does withdraw from this programme if all of a sudden we recognise that we now have a duty to prevent genocide.
On this second part of
just in terms of the characterisation of what I said earlier, clearly Israel does not have a carte blanche under international humanitarian law, and we've taken,
in which case there must be a line.
A whole series of steps so far. The question of whether or not should some further higher position of misery be reached where we did find a serious risk of genocide, clearly we would want to review all of our international legal obligations. I was not saying that necessarily F-35 would be one where there would be a change. It is clearly relevant that the judges who have looked at this have said that it would not make a difference to what happens in Gaza. That is not saying
clearly
we
you're
wouldn't
not
look
ruling
at it.
out an F-35 change.
I'm not ruling out any change if we made that determination.
Chair, I can answer your question in terms of withdrawing from the F-35 programme. So it is possible for any nation to withdraw from the F-35 programme. For a nation, when a nation withdraws from the F-35 programme, they are unable to use any of their F-35s again, which means that our carriers would no longer be used. Our F-35Bs from the RAF would not be able to be used. We would not be buying the F-35A for participating in NATO's nuclear mission. That would be the impact on the state-level activities. So we would not be able to use F-35s. But as the contracts that exist between UK manufacturers are not with the UK government, they're with the US government via the primes, those contracts would continue to be in place. It's worth understanding that in many cases the reason why we have the second highest level of content outside the US in an F-35 is because of the quality and ingenuity of the IP in those platforms. So it is not an F-35 IP in the ejector seat that we make in the UK, for instance. It is the IP of the UK firm that makes the ejector seat. At such point, if there's an export restriction on those, the replacement procurement to find alternatives for those would, in our estimate, take a number of years across that, which would then have an immediate impact effectively on the ability of the F-35 production line and the global spares pool to operate in the way that it currently does, which would be a quite considerable impact. So there is theoretically a route where you could do these things, but the impact on our own national security and those of our immediate allies, bear in mind that 12 of the 30 or so NATO members operate F-35, including allies further afield as well, that would be a significant impact and would therefore have a significant impact on UK-US relations in particular, and our ability as a nation to make the case for procuring other platforms with allies, bearing in mind that F-35 in the UK supports 20,000 jobs. That's not to say that we're not alive to the appalling situation that we see in Gaza, but that explains, I hope it explains the approach as to how the F-35 global programme works, but there are options.
Mr. Pollard, no one in Parliament can understand why you can't ground F-35s in Israel while keeping the rest of the global fleet flying. And so your advice, just laying out that rationale for Parliament, would be a great service to colleagues.
I'll be taking that away.
Brian Matthew.
Thank you. And if I could add on that point, and the partners, as I understand it, are the US, the UK, Italy, the Netherlands, Australia, Canada, and Norway. We get, I think I can broadly say, you've mentioned under Article 7.1, which would contribute or undermine peace and security. We get the importance of the F-35, but surely, and it would be interesting to know if there have been any attempts for the partners, or a certain number of the partners, and I'm sort of looking at that list, I can imagine that many of them actually are of similar mind to us, including the Netherlands, Australia, Canada, Norway, possibly Italy. The big bugbear, of course, in that is probably the United States. But if all of the partners, or at least a large majority of the partners, are saying the same thing to the United States, would that not perhaps affect them? Or at least, if Israel knows that discussion, I mean, we're talking diplomacy here apart from anything else, knows that discussion is happening, they might just be damn sure they don't use the F-35s in ways which the international community is going to object to.
I entirely understand the argument. that you're making. It is one that I'm struck with as well. You appreciate that I won't be able to go into the confidential conversations that we have as part of that international organisation. We maintain a regular dialogue with all the 8 partner nations, 7 plus us ourselves, as part of the partner nations of the F-35. It is something that all partners are aware of in terms of this debate, but it remains our assessment we can't reach consensus currently.
It might be useful to hear from Mr. Faulkner as well on that, because you're the FCDO, you're the diplomat in the room.
I am. So I think it's worth being really clear, and just going back to Mr. Maynard's suggestion about trying to reach consensus with, I think you suggested the US and Israel. Amongst those 8, there is clearly a variety of views about the situation in Gaza and the wider Middle East, and there's been no secret that the American government and the British government take a different approach to some of these questions. It is worth, I think, in conceiving whether or not, as Mr. Maynard suggests, that you could reach agreement with the US government on the components that we supply, which, to be clear, are sort of parts of the tail of the aeroplane, some electronics, ejector seats. It is worth just refreshing ourselves on what the US government is currently providing directly to not selling, directly providing to the US government. It includes
the Israeli government.
To the Israeli government. It includes more than 20,000 unguided bombs. It includes 25 F-35s just in total. It includes hundreds of drones, a range of F-15s, Hellfire missiles. This is clearly not the posture that we have taken in relation to Gaza. And so Mr. Maynard may be a much more effective diplomat than me and my colleagues. But I think, as the judge found in the Al-Haq case, it is clearly not reasonable to think that an agreement can be reached when, as Minister Pollard sets out, consensus is required. The US position is in a very different place. I won't comment on the other 8, but what is publicly available about US supplies to Israel is pretty clear about the different approach that they take on these questions.
Could I just go back to the point that I mentioned earlier, though? There may be a lot more common ground with those other partners than the US over this, and collectively you may have more impact in affecting the United States. So my thought and my question is, will you look at that? Will you look at that question and actually engage in at least a conversation with the other partners? Because clearly we're getting to a point where Israel needs to be reined in massively.
In relation to the United States of America's position towards what is going on in Gaza and the wider Middle East, I think we've said pretty clearly that this is a matter that we discuss directly with the US. There's, of course, a diplomatic judgment about whether or not we would seek to make progress on these issues with the US best bilaterally. We have a close relationship with the US, or as part of the F-35 program, as you'd expect. We take diplomatic judgments on that all the time.
Can I just, sorry, Chair, if I might just, because Mr. Maynard suggested something which I didn't hear properly. I think he suggested that one of the things that we might look at is whether we could only allow Israel to have F-35s for defensive operations. I think that's what he was saying. And if so, my anxiety is it's very difficult to... That's not the judgment we're making. The judgment we're trying to make is on the deployment. And once something has gone to Israel, it's very difficult to make a differentiation between offensive and defensive operations.
I'm going to move us on because I think we've covered that. Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. And Minister Faulkner, I just wanted to sort of slightly pick up on some of obviously what we've been talking about. We've heard a lot about technical language, and obviously quite rightly so, and the interpretation and Article 7, but globally people are watching with horror. Our constituents are watching with horror, and what they want to know is what power the government has and how it deploys it, what's available to it to try to help to bring an end to it. And we've talked a bit about some of the things that have been used, some of the things that have been implemented. So they want to know what is the pressure that can be put on? How are we doing that? Are we doing everything? And some of what we've heard in this session has related to licenses at the moment. You know, for example, we take the flight training equipment. So there may be a decision that's currently taken that, well, it's not going to be used at the moment. We could get into that again, but we've dealt with that. I think what people want to know is, why are we not putting everything available to us on the table? Why are we not making it difficult? Should it be that they can use training equipment or any other equipment? And why have we made a decision not to go as far as we can? Because it feels as though the evidence and the weight of that, for anybody watching, regardless of what the criteria might be, actually people don't necessarily want to hear too much about the technical argument now. They want the moral argument to succeed. And so I just wondered if you could speak to why we have still not made some of those decisions, and how much more power do we have, and why haven't we deployed it?
Well, thank you. I think it's absolutely obvious. I came in, as my colleagues did, as the Foreign Secretary at the time, came in with the policy objective of an immediate ceasefire. Other than for one brief period, we have not achieved that objective. We came in wanting the hostages out, humanitarian aid, Hamas removed. All of these things remain outstanding. I can assure the committee it is not from a lack of effort on the part of HMG that we have not made the progress that we want to see. We have announced to Parliament a whole range of measures which we hoped would lead to change, whether it's sanctions on Mr. Smotrich and Mr. Ben-Gvir, the steps we took in relation to the International Criminal Court, 3 waves of sanctions, restoring funding to UNRWA. All of these things have made very little impact, demonstrably, on what I think the Chair described as a descent in Gaza into ever greater horror. We now have famine in Gaza. I think it's only the 5th IPC determination in its history of famine. I cannot pretend to the committee that our efforts are working. Were they, we would not be in this situation. I find the discussion about arms exports in some ways to be frustrating, because it ends up in, as you say, quite a technical and detailed discussion. So let me try and set out from a Foreign Office perspective what we are trying to do in relation to these questions in Israel. Bombs, bullets, anything that can be used in Gaza, we have sought to suspend. Those things whose purposes we support, so for example, the Iron Dome, we do not wish to see missiles land in Tel Aviv. We do not want to see Iran able to threaten Israel. Where there are arms export licenses which support our policy, they continue. Where they do not, in relation to Gaza, and let me just put an asterisk there, they do not. We have discussed the F-35 programme in great detail, and it's an important programme. But we have, as I said, suspended F-15, F-16, Apache attack helicopters. The equipment that is used in the assessments I see is used much more regularly to cause harm in Gaza. So I understand why many of my constituents, and I'm sure yours in Tamworth as well, ask questions. Surely we can be doing more. If only there were a lever in the Foreign Office that me, the Foreign Secretary, or somebody else could pull in order to achieve the policy objectives we set out when we came in, and which still remain unachieved. We are doing everything that we can. I understand why the committee focuses in the way that it does, whether it's on trainer aircraft or F-35s or body armour which is used by NGOs. But honestly, my assessment is those things are very unlikely to move the Israeli government. If they were likely, when we suspended more arms licenses in one period than had been done in the whole 9 years previously, we would have seen a change in position from the Israelis, and we did not. So we will be coming back, I'm sure, to the whole House on questions of recognition shortly. We've set out the criteria and the timing very clearly. We will be coming back, I'm sure, on a whole range of other very important questions. And as I seek to assure my own constituents, and I would seek to assure yours and those of the committee, we are doing everything we can. There is not a day in which we are not focused on questions in Gaza, whether it's medically evacuating children, trying to get aid in, trying to ensure that we have the broadest possible diplomatic alliance for the things we do. This is a preoccupying concern for me, as I know it is for the Foreign Secretary.
And if I might, Chair, thank you for that answer. And so thinking about our partners and the perhaps pressure that we're trying to, and you and others are trying to bring about, What do they feel about the interpretation that we're making on some of these licenses? You know, how, because they may have taken a different view, they may have slightly different processes, but what is their view? And, you know, we take Spain, for example, the Spanish Prime Minister has already come out and made a statement about his views around genocide. And so how are those conversations implementing the direction of travel that the departments are now taking in relation to what do we do next? Because this is the powerlessness that constituents feel when they're rightly concerned, and you have also outlined how concerned you are as well. So from that perspective of pulling together our allies, our partners, what's next?
It's a very important question. I think, as the judges note, there are 8 other partners, as Minister Pollard sets out in the F-35 programme. None of them have considered that their continued input into the programme is a breach of their international legal obligations. They are all under the same obligations, both under the Arms Trade Treaty and other international legislation that we are. In terms of how we try and ensure diplomatically that there is the broadest possible coalition for what we do, we have sought, both over the summer and before, to try and use our leadership role to persuade, for example, 27 other countries to make joint statements about humanitarian aid. We announced the sanctions on Mr. Smotrich and Mr. Ben-Gvir in company with others, including Australia, Canada and New Zealand, I think. We are trying to play a leadership role, not, and I recognise that when we're going through treaty and law and licenses in the way that we are today, we can give the appearance of being sort of defensive. That's not at all the position. We are trying proactively to lead, and I'll be travelling to New York with the Foreign Secretary for High Level Week at the end of this week, and I expect that we will be seeking to continue to demonstrate that leadership on the international stage there, just as we did in July.
Thank you.
Matthew?
That's pretty much it from me. Yeah.
Just turn to the question that now lies ahead of you at the UN General Assembly. Has an assessment now been made that we will recognise the state of Palestine?
There was a Chair, I'm sure you know all this, but the previous Foreign Secretary set out in a statement in July the tests against which an assessment would be made. The Foreign Secretary will provide advice to the Prime Minister. It is the Prime Minister who makes determinations about recognition. The Foreign Secretary is considering that advice at the moment. The advice has not yet gone to the Prime Minister, but I would expect it to very shortly, given the timing of High Level Week.
So the advice is likely to go to the Prime Minister this week?
I would assume so.
If the decision is taken to recognise the state of Palestine, how will it change the way in which we control the export of weapons to Israel?
We will, again, Chair, I'm rather reluctant to go into the hypotheticals, but there are clearly there's a difference in international humanitarian law in the status of conflict between two states and the conflict within a state. So that will be obviously we will be turning our mind to those questions. In terms of our overall obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty, I don't think there would be an enormous change, because I think the tests remain pretty consistent regardless of the status you put on the territory in question. So I'm sure there will be some legal considerations if we are to make that determination. It's probably too early to be able to elucidate them to you all as clearly as you would like.
If we made that determination, would it not require us to examine much more closely the use of weapons in the West Bank?
Well, I don't want to prejudge what the Prime Minister might decide. I hope I don't seem evasive, Chair, but if we do make that decision, I recognise that Parliament will rightly be anxious to understand what the legal implications of recognising a Palestinian state are. So given how close it is, I'd prefer to try and address those questions after we've made the determination, if that would be okay.
I understand the prohibition on arms exports at the moment relates to arms that may be used in Gaza. Am I right in saying that there are licences for weapons that could still be used in the West Bank?
So the test is what is happening in Gaza, but as you've seen from the discussion this afternoon, we are looking mostly to what use they might be put. It is difficult for the reasons we discussed with Mr. Matthew to determine, in fact, which weapon systems are precisely used in Gaza. So the prohibitions, or the suspensions rather, of arms export licences, which were focused on Gaza, would also apply to the West Bank, because we have no geo-tracking on how these weapons are used. So Israel is engaged in a number of places. We would consider that the suspension of licences justified by IHL assessments of conduct in Gaza would also affect weapons in use in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, southern Syria, or anywhere in Lebanon.
The question we asked at the top of the meeting was whether any of the 55 extant licences for which the government of Israel is the end user were being used in Gaza, and Sir Chris said that they were not. Can you provide the same reassurance that the licences that are currently extant, where the government of Israel is the end user, are not being used in the West Bank?
I can. I will double check the point and write to you, but my understanding has always been that and just looking at the licences themselves, they are not, the air defence elements are not in use in West Bank. But I will double check the point and return to you. It's my understanding that the prohibitions that cover Gaza would also cover the West Bank and other places where similar such activity might be taking place.
Well, I was going to say all of that, but and I think it should probably be me that's writing to you.
Maybe a joint letter. Thank you very much. If there's no other questions from the committee...
Sorry, if I might just one thing.
Please.
Following UNGA, if whatever decision is made by everybody, if there are implications directly for us, then I'm very happy to write to the committee and engage with you directly.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think we've established that there is a line that constrains Israeli conduct, and so there may well be further sanctions and controls on weapons exports if there is an assessment that there is a potential risk of genocide and that our duties to prevent genocide are triggered. We've established that there are 55 licences still extant, that the government of Israel is the end user. You've undertaken to write to us with the detail that you can supply about what those licences actually relate to. Mr. Falconer, you've undertaken to share with us in the next IHL assessment a little bit more about your reasoning as to why the government has arrived at a decision that there is not a risk of genocide. You've also offered to share some of the legal logic which we lack about why you think a balancing test is possible within the constraints of Article 7 of the Arms Trade Treaty. And Mr. Pollard, we're grateful for your reassurance that you'll supply, to the extent that you can, an argument as to why we can't ground F-35s in Israel while keeping the rest of the global fleet flying. This committee, like you ministers, is looking at what is going on in Gaza with utter horror. We wish the hostages could come home soon, but really, the conduct of Mr. Netanyahu's government is simply outrageous, and we should not be complicit in it. Thank you very much indeed for providing us with evidence today and for the background evidence that you have supplied to us last week. That concludes this hearing.